Welcome to the MexPat interview. Today, we're going to talk about midwifery and maternal health care and broader inequities in public health in Mexico. My guest today is Janet Jarman. Janet is a photojournalist and documentary filmmaker who focuses on immigration, public health, and human rights issues. Her acclaimed 2019 film Birth Wars chronicles the contrasting visions of childbirth represented by Mexican doctors and midwives, and she has a book about this story coming out soon. Thank you for joining me, Janet.
Thank you, Kathleen. It's really a pleasure to be with you.
So we are both in San Miguel de Allende, and I'd like to start with a little personal background. So what brought you here to San Miguel?
Well, I had been living in Mexico City for several years around 2005 and working mostly for international publications as a photojournalist. And it was sort of an accidental reason I came here. I never imagined that I would live in San Miguel. And I came here one weekend and I just felt overwhelmed in a good way by just the city's uniqueness, the beauty, the light, the community that I found. And there are people from all over the world, from all over Mexico, and then deep rooted, fascinating San Miguelenses. I've been living in megacities for a long time. I had been in London and Tokyo and Mexico City. And I just found myself craving nature, and I wanted to be surrounded by trees and plants. And before I knew it, my husband and I had made a shift to live permanently here. This happens. Since most of my assignments were all over Mexico, I just figured that I would start driving to them since they were often in places that you can't fly easily. And I got to know the country in a totally different way. And this opened up a whole new Mexico for me. I went from super urban to semi-rural to very rural, and I fell in love with the landscapes, the culture of the small communities. I also had always dreamed of having a lot of dogs. This would be much easier in a smaller town. It's much easier here than it would be in Mexico City. And so there are just literally so many reasons why I came to San Miguel and so many reasons why I have never left. So, and I would say that the seeds of coming to Mexico as a country in the first place were probably planted long ago. And I didn't even know it. So it was just this path that I was on. I might not have known it. I fell in love first with Mexico by connecting with the land. In university, I did a national outdoor leadership school course on the Baja Peninsula, where I lived on the land and camped and hiked and sea kayaked and it was a nature course for 3 months. And then the more I started meeting people from Mexico, I realized it was a culture that I really wanted to get to know, and something about the way they approached life that was very appealing and quite real to me. And this attracted me. And as a photojournalist, I was attracted to Mexico because I saw a really dynamic country in transition and moving forward. And I also knew there was much more to Mexico than what the press, the media was covering. And I wanted to be part of constructing a more nuanced understanding of this hugely important neighboring
Mhm.
country.
Yes. And where are you from originally? Just quickly.
Yeah, I was born in Richmond, Virginia. So in the US and on the East Coast. So.
Well, moving from what drew you to Mexico more generally, what took you to covering this story, to midwives and maternal health care here?
For a long time, my first assignments here in Mexico for several years, I covered where international media sent me. And a lot of that was to cover violence and to cover issues that you see in the media. And as a reaction to that, I was always trying to do projects on my own time, whatever I could do to show a more, a nuanced vision or to show mainstream themes about the world in a unique or different way. So that's sort of what I've always tried to do as an independent journalist. So my coverage of this particular theme began in 2013 when I was in Chiapas, and I met these extraordinary women, and they were traditional indigenous midwives. And I loved the way that they treated women in a holistic way, the way that they approached health. They were leaders in their communities, and they didn't treat the women as patients, but as, human beings who really deserved respect and dignity and to give birth according to their customs. And they were also the only caregivers the women trusted, and they were being treated, but they were being rejected by the institutional system. And I wondered why. At the same time, I met a number of teachers and students at midwifery schools, some here in San Miguel, and doctors in hospitals. And as I learned more about their conflicts and their challenges, it became clear to me that this was a story that was about an unequal power structure that often was perpetuating obstetric violence and discrimination against women, and that this was a pattern that repeated itself across the world, literally. So this study, this project also, it fits into a primary theme that runs through my work, which is whether I'm working on environmental stories or pretty much any story I begin to cover is about systems of power. And healthcare, health systems are certainly about that because women are being denied respect and dignity and the right to choose if and how and where and with whom they give birth. So I wanted to bring to the world's attention that there is a movement to bring birth back to a woman centered model instead of a doctor driven process, and where to bring it back to one where women are the focus and where they're treated with respect and where they have the right to choose and make all the decisions during childbirth. And so one of my other goals in continuing, because I often ask myself, how did you approach the topic, but also how did you become so immersed, and then how did you continue? And so one of my other primary goals in photography and journalism has always been to try to break down stereotypes to promote understanding. So there is so much misinterpretation, misunderstanding in the world. And I saw a group of important health workers who were marginalized, misunderstood, disrespected in some cases, and they were suffering from discrimination and often racism. So I think that so many prejudices are just rooted in fear of the unknown. So I feel like it's my job to show reality and nuances and try to help promote this understanding. If you can't see it, you can't know it. And I wanted to take people into the trenches where maternal health care is playing out. And I just hoped to bring viewers into the worlds and lives of these brave and really committed women that I was meeting. I also wanted to just show a system that there are two systems of health and, community-based health systems based on ancestral knowledge and this institutional system that has not been, has been around for a lot less time than the ancestral system. So I wanted to show how these worlds could coexist and somehow create a mutual respect so that the discrimination can stop.
Well, I can just say from my personal experience, I was really deeply moved by birth wars. And I gave birth to both of my daughters here. And I was so fortunate because I was able to have the support of both a midwife and an OB and to have my decisions and my wishes respected. And you've talked about how this story isn't just relevant to women or to mothers because it's about human rights. So could you explain a little bit more about how you see it this way?
Yes. And it just unveiled itself to me as I went along. And as I developed the story about the problem, I also saw the solutions. I think in our time, at this time, we're clearly seeing the battle over women's bodies has reached a proportion, a new intensity. And not only are we being denied the right to choose if we give birth, our decision power over how we wish to give birth is also being eroded. Hence the title Birth Wars. I wanted people to know that they'll be entering a world of conflict. And this is a case of conflict about who has the decision power over who gets the jobs, who controls the maternal health funding. It's an unequal fight where the medical establishment has a lot of power. And there are a lot of people, many women's rights, maternal health rights advocates around the world who see their efforts as a true fight for justice and equality. So that speaks about human rights. And so as I dug deeper into the issues affecting midwives and the people that they serve, I I felt a strong calling as a journalist and also as a woman to tell this vastly complex story on the topic of respectful childbirth because I saw that it was an important human rights story, and it's a story that involves so many of the topics that I care about, and so many topics. It's so much more than just about babies. It involves bodily autonomy, gender equality, culture, indigenous rights, politics, gender, science, and the environment. So it's a multi-layered story, and it's hardly just about birth. This is also interesting because I believe strongly that this is a human rights story, and I'm constantly telling editors that this is not about babies. It's not about mothers only. It is really a story about human rights. I think it's been so unfair to categorize birth in journalism circles or editing circles as just a women's issue. It's happened since the beginning of my career, and it might have been one of the reasons why I saw that it wasn't covered. These stories were shelved because people thought more important stories were about war and other types of conflicts. But I mean, this is a conflict, a huge conflict that affects so many people across the world. So it's it would upset me that it was called a women's issue because men are affected completely, and so are babies. I mean, think of all the people who are affected if there is birth trauma, and it's a chain that could affect a person's entire life. And so, yeah, it's definitely a human rights story. And if you can just watching men, for example, witness the birth of their child when they normally wouldn't be allowed to in a public system because of infrastructure and rules and protocol, and those were some of the most meaningful scenes that I covered, watching men with tears streaming down their faces. And I began to think of the coldness and rigidity of birth that often can involve unnecessary medical procedures, not just cesareans, but routine episiotomies, for example, pressure on women to have operations. And it's not fair to the mother. It's a human rights issue because it's not fair to the mother, but it's also not fair to the baby and to other family members, potentially. So, and I just think that the last experience I have in the book, one of the most recent births I covered was a woman named Leela, and she had dreamed of giving birth in a temazcal on her family's property. And she had dreamed in the dream, her baby told her, also decided this. And she was determined to find midwives equipped to take her through this experience. And she had researched everything and she had been scared by her doctors, but she was super strong and determined. And I watched the whole thing unfold. And if you can see a birth, every time you see a birth that occurs on a woman's own terms with her own decisions, where she can be the protagonist of her own birth and be supported by midwives who will certainly know what to do in an emergency and will certainly have a plan B. It's just a really extraordinary thing to watch how a whole family interacts and to know that. And I think so many people don't know that there's another way. And there's a lot of lack of information. So I think it's an extreme human rights issue and one of the most important human rights issues of our time that's largely uncovered because it's considered a women's issue, not as much anymore.
Mhm.
So that's why I say that. And that's why I keep going back to that. And we're at this critical time in history where um, just so many problems. And feel like we need to create a new type of society that's more empathic. And I think, and there are many people who've convinced me that this can start at birth.
Right. Right. And it's interesting because I think that, as you're saying, some of this is changing. There is more recognition of what midwives bring to the table, and not just as traditional community support for women, but also from a public health standpoint, especially for low risk births. They actually are an asset to the public healthcare system, and they're seen that way in other countries. So, looking at statistics a little bit, I mean, um, the maternal mortality rate in Mexico actually did decline in 2024 compared to the year before, but the number of births accompanied by midwives is very low, at least that is recorded. But also the C-section rate in Mexico is very high. It was 55% of births in 2023, which is far above the recommendation of the World Health Organization. So, what changes have you seen, if any? I'm sure there have been some, but since you started working on the filming of this?
Yeah, that's a great question because I have covered this for a long time now. And that's the beauty of doing a long term project because you can actually see change and you can go back places over and over and maintain relationships and talk to people. And each time you go back, you just peel off another layer of the problem, but also the solutions. So I think there have been, over the last 10 years, Mexico's seen many efforts there's so many things I wanted to have, whatever. They've just seen so many efforts to promote the quality midwifery care and schools and professional training programs, and to better integrate this into midwifery into the Mexican medical health system, and to demonstrate the legitimacy of midwifery. And I think in 2019, we were invited, one legislator announced a new initiative to better integrate midwives into Mexico's health system. And we were invited to show birth wars in the Congress as part of this initiative. And that was thrilling because one of the main reasons I wanted to help sensitize policymakers and decision makers to the value of what I was seeing, the value that midwives had in saving lives, not only creating better care, not or quality care, but saving lives, and just what they could add to hospital systems or standalone centers, or it's not just something that has to be integrated into hospitals. So, and also much of the film took place in the state of Guerrero. And at the time, there was a lot of effort to get midwives integrated into the system. And the Secretary of Health gave me incredible access to the hospitals, and he wanted me to show reality. And they wanted midwives to be hugely important links to save lives and to help women through the continuum of care. And so they had all these ideas. And so even there was still not ways to give many midwives contracts. And the contracts that they gave, sometimes they were more about translation. And so a lot of the midwives I talked to graduating from the schools were obviously very frustrated because they are some of the most passionate people I've ever met in anything I've ever done. And they are passionate feminists. They love what they do, and they are ready to really help women with great skills to go through this very important time. I would say that even in a state like that, there were not as many contracts. And one of the characters in the book was invited to work at various jobs in hospitals. And she said it took her, at first, she really felt rejected. And it took her so long to feel like she was part of a team. It actually took her about 6 years. So that indicates that the progress is very slow because systems have to change so much. Infrastructure, like ingrained attitudes, doctor knows best attitude has to change. Infrastructure in hospitals has to change because the infrastructure is not just always there to give midwives a separate space. I did see many positive situations. One of the main ones where the young guy was just crying, one of those moments I talked about earlier, was in Tlapo de Comonfort, where they did have, but I don't think they do now, a separate section for midwives, and a couple could walk into the hospital and choose institutional or midwife. If it was considered a low risk birth, and they chose midwife, and it just made I saw what a difference it made to them. So, let's say slow progress, a paradigm shift really needs to happen. But I think people thought that the COVID-19 pandemic would really be an impetus for an increase in the use of midwives, and the government. There were plans to create midwife-led birth centers in Mexico because hospitals were even more filled or oversaturated, and they were close. Maternity units were turned into COVID units. So obviously, and people were so scared to go to the hospital for obvious reasons. So there was an increase in home births, and there was an increase in midwife led home births. But the centers never really developed at that time.
Mhm.
And now, so they didn't materialize too much. So there has been a revived effort recently with a new law or a new regulation that will try to incorporate midwives into the health system. And overall, I believe, so it's too early to know if that will
I
really
think it
create.
just went into effect. I mean, a few
It
months
did.
ago.
And
Yeah.
there are some people for it, and there's some people who see it positively, and some people who do not, especially indigenous traditional midwives who truly believe that their state has no place in controlling traditional indigenous midwives because they are protected by the Mexican Constitution. And so I can see both sides of this, and it's really too early to tell probably what will happen. I think early on in this project, I realized that it would be very difficult to incorporate all midwives in Mexico under one umbrella and try to make them work under one system. There are different types of midwives. There are
Yeah, could you
traditional.
explain that a little bit more, the different types of midwives that are working here?
Right, the different types of midwives I've seen. Mexico has an incredibly strong, in Guatemala also. I've covered this topic in Guatemala, and there are a lot of similarities. So there, definitely a strong tradition of traditional midwifery that's been around for forever, and ancestral knowledge that goes with that. In community health systems, you have traditional midwives who might live in cities but they're nonetheless following traditional health practices and traditional medicine practices, autonomous midwives who could work independently, urban midwives, midwives who work in predominantly rural areas, and then a newer group of professional midwives, people coming out of the schools that have been created here in Mexico and, in different parts of the world who have a different type of training. And so the film Birth Wars actually takes you through the life, focuses on the life of a traditional midwife in Chiapas, Guadalupe, and a new graduate from the Guerrero School of Professional Midwives, Rafaela, because I wanted to show these two situations and what brings all of these midwives together. They might be slightly different, and women are different too. Different types of women, different types of communities, different settings where they live, different cultural backgrounds. So there is no one solution that fits all, I don't think. And
Hmm.
and I think that's important to know, but the overarching goal of all of them is the same. And that is to provide to run a woman-centered care system again, or to bring that back and bring sanctity and emphasize the sacredness of birth again, and put the woman at the center, allow her to make all of her decisions. So, I mean, it really is a movement to change an obstetric model that many have come to accept. And it's a type of revolution in birth, in birth. And to think that this has all happened in this time, in just a few short decades, midwives who've been attending births for so long throughout history, and then in a few decades become so marginalized, almost to the point where some would claim authorities want to eradicate them and stop a lifestyle and an ancient lifestyle. It's very interesting that it's happened in such a short time. So I feel like it's such a critical time to really, and I feel like it's really shifting. And there is a strong desire all over the world to take birth back in this way.
Hmm.
So back to changes. So back to changes that I've seen. I definitely think one of the most interesting changes is being able to witness the growth, the initiation and the growth of an expansion of an indigenous traditional midwife advocacy group. Started working and seeing the efforts of Nichishim and Chiapas, and then that grew into a national movement, the national agenda. So when over time you can see this, I'd say that's the most concrete change and move this national movement here. But I've seen over the last decade that it wasn't happening when I started as much, but I've seen over a decade how midwives have unified and learned about their rights and how to fight to defend their rights. And some of the leaders of this movement have even gone to the UN, and they have created an alliance of the Americas that really cannot be ignored. So I think that their voices are heard, and the defense of their way of life they're definitely making an impact. So I've watched that unfold over time. And then also, not just an international movement, it's also in Guatemala. And I think that so much on an international level, the leaders in Mexico, or the midwives of Mexico and Guatemala, are so important, and their work and their struggle is so important. I think a lot of people will be looking at them to see what's happening in this movement. So, and then I guess I could say also that there definitely more, when I started this project, there were no stories about midwives. Was hardly any coverage. It took me about 6 months and I'm so grateful to Celia Duggar at the New York Times. I mean, 6 months is not a long time in that world. You're looking to get space for an article. So it's not that much time, but I remember there weren't that many stories. So I'm very grateful that she printed that first story and the second story during COVID, because people wrote me after that article and said, I'm so excited that the New York Times has put this on such a global scale. So thank you so much. And I began to realize just how important this topic was to so many people. I mean, it was obvious, but when letters came in, it really solidified things and helped me go on. So there are definitely more stories. So I remember at that time talking to an editor there, and I mentioned obstetric violence. This is 2014. And he nearly panicked. I mean, I saw panic on his face. He just didn't, what do you mean violence? And it was a word that just wasn't in the mainstream yet. And I decided and so that time, just that short of it wasn't that long ago when this was not in the news. And now there are more stories. There's an ecosystem growing of stories. And I think that can only help. Because there's really a lack of information out there. I've met so many powerful and brave really brave women and midwives and mothers who choose to give birth in a different way. And they inspire me so much. And I am certain that they can continue to inspire everyone around there and to continue pressuring for change because it is definitely not going to stop.
No, I mean, have you seen any changes as far as the reaction from the medical profession, or doctors in particular who you've worked with or talked to?
Throughout the project for the whole time I've been covering this, I have seen doctors. I've definitely talked to doctors who have worked with midwives and can appreciate the work and respect everything that they do, and also in the context of the communities, the complex communities where they work. So I can't say that I mean, after the film and after the pandemic, I sort of moved away from hospitals and I did a portrait series, and I also worked a lot more with ancestral customs. I've done a lot of work with placentas, explaining the importance of placentas. So I have not talked to, I can't say that I have statistics saying it's more accepted,
Mhm,
but I definitely think people do not jump to conclusions as quickly about midwives as they used to. It's very simple to think, well, that they're, it's easy to think that there's just one solution. But I think people in general understand a little bit better. I still think there's a long way to go, especially in the public, because think about the fear that we've grown up with. Think about the fear in our culture right now about so many things. And birth
mhm,
is in the center of that fear movement. Look at television, look how birth is portrayed as painful and could have so many complications. And so I think that this fear is being unraveled, and it's unraveled by this movement and by just some incredible leaders that I've met, just not just in Mexico and Guatemala, but also in Pakistan and Indonesia, where I've worked recently on the same theme, well, in the last couple of years. So I think until you try to break down that fear element, you'll
mhm,
see slow progress. The fear that because we just assume that the hospital is the best place to give birth. I mean, even Rafaela told me that in an interview. Her first child. She said, I just thought I had to go to the hospital. That was what you do. And not until I really, returned and studied to become a midwife did I realize that I suffered obstetric violence and I didn't even know it.
mhm,
So that's someone deeply involved in the maternal health movement. So we have to get by that fear that the hospital is the only place. And it might, in fact, not even be the safest place if you think about disease and think about the pandemic. And so, and I think, and just the fear to just imagine that birth could happen in an alternative way in a home. And it could also obviously be extremely safe and satisfying for some. And then, yeah, I think it's so much. That's what I've really come to conclude over the past couple of years as I've seen this, that fear, ingrained attitudes, doctor knows best, and then just this fear of everything.
mhm,
And until you see it,
mhm,
maybe people won't realize how successful it can be. And just like I found out with doctors early on in the film, they would tell me, we just haven't seen it. If more doctors, and there could be more opportunities for doctors to see the way midwives work and for midwives to see the way doctors work, then that would just be, and it is, those events do happen. And I mean, that is what is going to grow and promote this mutual respect because you just need the mutual respect.
mhm.
One of the quotes in the book is just about that. There are two systems of health. And if doctors and midwives and traditional medicine practitioners, and if there's mutual respect, then of course the systems can work in parallel or they can benefit each other.
I think particularly in remote rural communities, right, where even access to a hospital or to medical care can be difficult, very difficult. I mean, that is where they can absolutely save lives.
And they do.
Yes.
And I mean, that is, um, think about the pandemic. The midwives I met, the midwives I've worked with in Chiapas and Guerrero and other places in Mexico, they were the ones on the front lines during the pandemic. Health centers shut down in remote areas and the doctors, our whole system is overwhelmed. Places were abandoned. They were on the front lines with no, support, financial support or for protection and protective gear. And people, lived through it. They were not maternal deaths and they were out there doing the work of, and often in remote communities. I think that's something that if you can, talked about mutual respect. I talked about recognizing that there are two systems at work and how they can appreciate one can, the two systems can appreciate and learn from each other. And it's just they're doing so much work in remote areas that the system is not doing. So that I would say first step to understanding is to respect the traditional midwives and stop the discrimination against them. I mean, they're crucial players in pueblos originarios where they work, and they always have been. So that respect has to be there. And I've seen events where that respect is there. And I've seen very horizontal events where there's a lot of respect. They'll have translators, they'll have and there a lot of collaboration and a lot of excitement about learning together. And I've seen other types of events where it's completely top down. And those events I would say don't work as well. And I think this understanding that not all traditional midwives in remote areas can participate. I mean, you can assume they could participate in an institutional system, but not all traditional midwives can participate, nor do they want to. They've been immersed in a system of health that works um, for them for their whole lives, and so I think that's one assumption that people sometimes have. And yeah,
Well, so what is next for you? I know you have this book coming out. So tell me a little bit more about the book.
yeah, the book is a culmination of this stage of the work. The film was one stopping point a long time ago, and it seems like yesterday, but it was several years ago. And in that project, I really wanted to show these contrasting systems of health. And I wanted to really draw attention to the midwife model of care and what it means to women, the midwives, families. And it was directed a lot at decision makers, and there was a lot going on in Mexico, and there still is on this topic. But it's such a big topic that you just can't tell the whole story in one film, in one book. And so little by little, each era of this story has led to another one, and then another one, and then another one. So I think the film led to a larger story on how to give birth, what is it like to give birth during COVID or during a pandemic. And I did a lot of work in super remote regions and cities during the pandemic. And so that came out in a series of that came out mostly in international media. The New York Times ran a piece and Geographic ran a piece. And then after that, the story just kept evolving, and you think, well, what else? And it just leads to other aspects. And I realized that I had been inside women's homes a lot for reasons of that's usually where birth takes place. But I also wanted to show this concept of territory that's so important. Like, where do the women work? What are their communities? And so I did a series of portraits in different areas across Mexico. And then, as I said, I got into the more ancestral knowledge and traditions about placentas and ceremonies around placentas and the importance of that connection, not ignoring this essential part of the birth process. So that's all of that now is I'm combining in a book form, and it's part of the same MacArthur grant, but it's being published by Photo Evidence, which is a publisher dedicated to photojournalism books, but they're all about human rights. I've been working on it for about 2 years, and Sarah Lean is the editor. She was the former director of photography at National Geographic, and she has just helped me pull this into a narrative that I never could have done. It's so much work, and I'm so grateful for her work and all the people involved. So we have what I hope will be a unique book that can be used to draw attention to this issue, just like I wanted the film to be. If I can just do whatever I can to challenge the narrative. So this is another part of that effort that I hope will bring people closer to the reality that women face during birth, and the reality and the changes that could happen and the way things could change. So the next project, I will have to admit, I love being in the field. I love it so much. I love meeting people, being with people, feeling the earth around me, and telling stories about, deep issues. But I do have to take a moment to it's like the film. You make a film, but everyone told me the the second half of the film is to actually get it out there and distribution. And so the book is really no different. And I really feel strongly about having a tool that can be used to create dialogue and to make impact and to have the same types of talks that we had and panels that we had with midwives. I want this to be able to really promote dialogue in the same way. So that will take a long time. That takes a lot of work. And then after that, I would definitely plan to get back into my issues that I've been covering. I do a lot of work on water issues, source issues and problems, and I've done them here in the state of Guanajuato, but also around the country. And I really want to get back into environmental issues. And I would say um, the other issue is just animals. I have to do stories, I've focused on humans for a long time, but animals are a huge part of my life. And I believe so strongly that all beings are equal. And that will be one of my next stories.
Well, thank you so much
Thank you.
for taking the time to talk.
Thank you so much.
And for anyone who's listening, if you want to stay on top of the national conversation in Mexico, check out my newsletter, The Mex Patriot. Until next time.